Hi everyone, I'm Darcy Bono and welcome to one of my very rare product demonstration videos. If you've seen my channel before, you know I pretty much just paint. But as a content creator, I am frequently asked to promote products for companies, and most of them have nothing to do with hobbying at all. So you can imagine my excitement when a company asked if I'd like to demonstrate their airbrush kit instead of exercise bikes or software I will never probably use. So this is just full disclosure, full transparency. This is a paid sponsorship video. However, that just means that they're paying me to showcase their product. There's no non-disparagement agreement. That non-disparagement clauses prevent you from saying negative things. That is not in this video. This is my honest opinion. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at this bundle. We're gonna just go over the basic features, how it's pitched, and things I like, things I dislike, and then applications for how I use my airbrush. So let's get some better audio in here with a voiceover and an overall look at what comes in the box. This is literally everything you need to start airbrushing with the exception of primer. I've never seen an airbrush kit that actually comes with primer, but if you want any recommendations, there are links in the video description for primers I like to use with my airbrush. So primers aside, this comes with everything you need to start airbrushing, including some nice additions that most kits don't include. For example, it comes with a quick disconnect that makes it much easier to connect your brush and disconnect it for when you need to clean it. And speaking of which, it actually comes with everything that you need to clean it as well, including a squeeze bottle, brushes, and the airbrush cleaning solution itself. It also comes with 3 separate nozzle sizes, which is fantastic because you can do your fine detail with the same brush that you're using to prime your miniatures just by changing the nozzle head. And I'm going to show you how they function and how to do that later in this video. And it does come with the 0.3mm nozzle pre-installed, so you are ready to start with a good middle-of-the-road nozzle size straight out the box. I'd also like to point out that the kit comes with a good amount of material that is specifically designed to help hobbyists who are new to airbrushing. So it walks you through what to do, what to avoid, how to properly clean your airbrush, and more importantly, it shows examples of troubleshooting as far as this is the result I'm getting, how do I fix this? That is incredibly useful and takes out so much of the frustration that I first encountered when I started airbrushing. And the final cool little addition in the package is this very handy color wheel. Now, for people who are new to miniature painting, this might seem overly complex, but it is essentially just color theory in your hand. It helps you select colors, explains the complementary colors, and also what happens when you mix colors together. We're not going to get into how to use this. There's a full instructions on how to use this. This is just a kind of above and beyond addition to this airbrush kit that will help you overall as a painter. So this is the Inokraft compressor. It's a nice small little unit that comes in a casing about the size of a large lunchbox. It's very lightweight. It's about 8 pounds, so is really great if you have a small workspace or if portability is a factor for you. So it is just a small single cylinder 1.6 horsepower compressor. There's the power switch on the back, and you'll notice that it is tankless. And I'll touch a little bit more on that in just a sec. It also comes with a handy little airbrush holder for you to place your airbrush in when you're done. You might also notice that the moisture trap here is doing its job. It's been raining for the past 2 days, so it's collecting moisture in there so it doesn't go into my hose. As far as ease of use, it's very straightforward to adjust the air pressure. Just pull up on this knob, and then all you do is rotate it depending on how much pressure you would like, and then push it back down to lock it in place. So we got our airbrush. There's no paint in here or anything. I just wanted you to be able to hear what the compressor sounds like. I personally think it's really quiet. It is a tankless compressor, so that means it's going to run whenever you depress the airbrush, causing air to flow through. It'll constantly try to fill itself. Once it reaches a certain air pressure, it will turn off. So what that means is that there is a sporadic amount of sound. That's literally how most tankless compressors work, is that the motor doesn't continuously run and burn itself out. So here's what it sounds like when you turn it on. That's it. It's a very low, dull rumble. Now, it is sporadic because it's going to be based on how much you're pressing, how much air pressure you're putting through here, how often you're pressing your trigger. Right now, it's about 25 psi, so it's going to be pretty much with every puff of the airbrush. So I'm generally wearing headphones at the time listening to music or podcast or whatever. I also have an airbrush tent where it's literally like a little station with a fan that sucks the vapors out through the back of the box. So I have a fan running and I have headphones on. I am not going to notice this sporadic turning on and off of the compressor kit. However, if you think it's going to get on your nerves, I could see that being an issue for some people, but the whole point of it turning on and off is just so the motor's not running continuously. So just a factor to be aware of. That being said, outside of that, this is solid. This is a good little compressor that I've put it through its paces for the past week and have had no issues. It does run warm towards, then again, I was working with it for a few hours. It was probably about 2.5 hours, and it got fairly warm towards the end. And I was using it for a pretty thorough amount of time. So base coating, priming, that kind of thing. And it held up just fine for a small little compressor. So as far as just being a good starter unit, good job, buddy. And before we move on to the airbrush techniques and demonstration, I just had a few notes I wanted to add. I just wanted to emphasize that this is an entry-level compressor. You might hear from some hobbyists that you need a compressor that has a tank, that tank compressors are infinitely better, and that's not bad advice. However, you need to think of your needs first. Compressors with tanks are generally more expensive because there's an added component to the machinery. Second, if you're not airbrushing all the time, if you are just a casual hobbyist who occasionally uses your airbrush, and when you do, it's not for hours and hours on end, then this level of compressor will work just fine. I'd also like you to keep in mind that having a tank does not guarantee longevity. When I first started airbrushing in 2019, I started with an Iwata Sprint Jet. That was a constant run tankless compressor. There was no on-off feature. It was running until you hit the switch to turn it off. I was starting to take commissions around that time, so I was painting regularly, and it lasted about 2 years. What I replaced it with was a 2-cylinder tank compressor by Masters, and it functioned correctly for less than a year. The replacement they sent me died in a matter of months. For the past couple years, I've been using a hardware store compressor by Makita. It took a little bit of tinkering to get it to work with an airbrush. However, I use something this size because I'm a full-time commission painter. I'm painting and priming and using an airbrush more often and for longer duration than most hobbyists. But for someone who is new to airbrushing, who's just starting out, a tankless compressor will get the job done. So this is the Inokraft airbrush. And let me just preface this with, I own multiple airbrushes from different brands, all of which are mainstream name brand airbrushes. And this includes brands like Grex, Iwata, and Harder and Steenbeck. My most used airbrush at the moment is the Iwata Eclipse. I own both the 0.5 and 0.35mm nozzles for it. I can confirm that the Inokraft airbrush does have a very similar performance to the Iwata Eclipse, but at nearly 1/4 of the cost. The price point for the Inokraft airbrush is incredibly low. It's only $40 on Amazon. The compressor bundle that comes with everything is just over $160 if you factor in tax. That's about the price of just the airbrush, nothing else to it, for all these other brands. Yet I found the Inokraft airbrush pretty comparable to all these other models. So before we move forward, I just want to show you a few of the additional features. We've got the quick connect here. That comes in the bundle, not in the solo airbrush itself. And then we have the trigger control on the back. That is a nice addition to a lower budget airbrush. I was surprised that was on there. This is especially useful for beginners that don't have quite the trigger control yet, because all you do is you tighten it and it prevents the trigger from moving too far back, which helps prevent you from applying more paint than you mean to and just allows for much more precision. So let's get to spraying some paint. As I mentioned earlier, this box comes with some very helpful material for new painters. It comes with 2 of these practice sheets. You could probably just run off copies of these, as many as you need. It also comes with a handful of paints as well as airbrush cleaner and thinner. Before I show you how this sprays, I just want to point out the one thing I don't like about it, and that's that it has a very tiny hole leading from the paint cup to the actual body and nozzle. The reason I don't like this is because I'm used to mixing my paints in the cup with an old brush. It just allows for a very thorough, quick mix. Unfortunately, this is a really small hole, so unless you have a tiny brush, or you can put in a toothpick or a barbecue skewer and twist it around like what I'm doing here, I don't think it mixes quite as evenly as quickly. You can also use the blowback technique in where you cover the nozzle with your finger and then very lightly press down and pull back on the trigger to help mix the paint as well. Speaking of which, a major component of successfully airbrushing is thinning your paints. You're generally going to want them to reach a consistency that's similar to skim milk. In order to reduce the chance of clogging, I generally will make a thinner paint thinner sandwich. And by that I mean I'll add a few drops of thinner to the airbrush first, followed by about twice as many drops of paint, and then add a couple drops more of thinner on top of that before mixing it all together. Now, your exact ratio is going to vary depending on the brand of paint you're using, the color of the paint you're using, as well as the transparency you wish to achieve. A rule of thumb is that it's generally better to start too thin and then add more paint as you need it, rather than having your paint come out too thick, which can of course clog the nozzle as well as create flecks in your spray pattern. So I started the spray test using the black paint first. Black is the easiest color to airbrush with, and I recommend it to beginners because it has the smallest pigment particles, meaning it's the least likely to clog. And I'm using the 0.3mm nozzle here. That's the one that comes equipped to the airbrush right out the box. As you can see, it gives me plenty of control even when I'm pulling back for a much larger spray pattern. So this nozzle size will cover a lot of your bases. It's great for doing fine details, stuff like this. You could paint glow effects with it in a confined area comfortably. I honestly prefer it to the 0.2mm just because the 0.2 is so fine that it tends to clog. And I mean that for any brand of airbrush. Just 0.2mm is insanely small, and you're almost never painting pencil thin lines on your miniatures. So the 0.3 will certainly get the job done, both for larger surfaces and for smaller concise areas. The main nozzle I use is actually the 0.5mm, and that's because it covers just a larger area, and generally that's what I use my airbrush for, is covering large areas very quickly. But you can also use it to paint very fine detail as well. Not quite as fine as the 0.3, but it can certainly hold its own. But keep in mind, if you want a very fine line, you need to reduce the air pressure, usually under 20 psi, and bring your airbrush much closer to the surface of the model. As far as changing out the nozzle size goes, it's pretty straightforward and almost identical to any of my other airbrushes. First, I remove the back of the airbrush and then remove the needle chuck, which holds the needle in place. The reason I'm doing this now is to limit the handling in between the time I have the nozzle removed and the needle exposed. So once the needle is unlocked, I then go to remove the nozzle. I remove the nozzle cap first. You can do that with your fingers, and then that exposes the nozzle proper. The Inokraft airbrush nozzles are screw-in, which is great because it helps limit the amount of air leakage around the nozzle where it meets the body of the airbrush. What that means is that these tips are very tiny, so you need to be very careful when removing them. I recommend removing the nozzle over a tray or a small bowl. I don't recommend doing it over a paper plate because I've catapulted things into oblivion that way by accident. Once the nozzle's removed, you can then push the needle through the front of the airbrush. I do it this way to prevent pulling any dried paint into the body of the airbrush, which could affect airflow. So push the needle through, and then you basically just reverse the process in installing the new nozzle. Just very gently tighten this with the wrench. Don't over tighten it, as you'll run the risk of breaking it off inside the airbrush, which I did with my Iwata one time. It was fun. So anyway, just feed the needle back in, put the chuck back on. And I should have done this before I put the needle back in, but make sure to replace the head with the corresponding size of your nozzle. They all have different sizes based on the nozzle you're using. Put the cap back on, and then put your back of your airbrush back, and you are good to go. All right, you've seen the compressor, you've seen the airbrush. Let's put some paint on a miniature. And while the vast majority of my painting is done with a traditional paintbrush, I just wanted to showcase a few important techniques that are greatly facilitated by using an airbrush. The thing I use my airbrush for the most is priming my miniatures. And I get it's not an exciting application, but it is very important because it sets up the foundation for the entire painting process. And as someone who prefers bright and vibrant color schemes, as well as working predominantly with contrast paints, I find myself priming my miniatures white quite often. As I mentioned before, white has the largest pigment particles and is the most likely to look speckled or chalky, especially when applied via rattle can. But as you can see, the Inokraft airbrush had no problem at all when it came to applying white primer. By applying primer via airbrush, I have much more control over the atomization, that is the quality, the fineness of the mist of paint. Therefore, I don't soak my miniature in white paint. I apply it evenly in thin layers, and thus will have much more crisp detail to work with when I go to apply the rest of my paints to the miniature. One very important tip, no pun intended, when it comes to priming, especially with white, and it is to keep your needle tip clean. You can take a cotton swab dipped in airbrush cleaner so it's wet and lightly pat it around the needle, but the easiest way to do it and the most thorough way to do it is just to remove the needle cap, take the wet cotton swab, and lightly pat the needle, removing any dried paint. This isn't something you have to do all the time. I just wanted to bring it to your attention as it is crucial for if you're doing longer sessions, as this will prevent the buildup of dried paint flecks potentially blowing onto the miniature surface. So let's get to something much more fun. Another major use for my airbrush is when I want to establish a smooth color gradient, especially over a larger, smoother surface, such as one that you might see on a vibrant red cloak. And while I didn't have any more big billowy cloak miniatures, I did have this Infernal Enrapturous who has a very flowy gown that will serve the same purpose. So before we get started on the fabric, I did establish my undershading via airbrush first. For newer painters, undershading is establishing your shadows and your highlights before applying a tint or a filter to the miniature, essentially a transparent color over top of those highlights and shadows. I did this now in order to prevent getting paint on my pretty red gown later. Some of you may have heard this referred to as zenithal, but zenithal is just undershading applied mostly from above. Undershading can be anywhere, really. It's just establishing your lights and shadows. For example, you're later going to see me apply an undershade of burgundy to the recessed areas of the poor schlub harp guy, so he would have more of a reddish purple skin tone underneath instead of the desaturated shadows due to the black underlayer we started with. So first things first, before you apply airbrush paint to a miniature, test your spray pattern, make sure your consistency is smooth, and this is just a standard base coat using Sigvald Burgundy, and I apologize for the crappy camera angle. This is actually my first time airbrushing on camera, so I found it kind of hard to hold the miniature and airbrush in a way that was comfortable for me. I honestly generally hold it really close and use my chest as a tripod for my brush hand. It gives me a lot of stability and it's comfortable. So having it further away from me was kind of an awkward angle. And now it's awkward for everybody because we can't see because I'm partially out of frame, but it's fine. I'm just applying a base coat using an airbrush. This is Sigvald Burgundy Contrast. It is incredibly opaque, but very thin and very smooth. I absolutely love this paint. The reason I'm applying this now is because whenever you paint red, if you apply it over black, black significantly desaturates your warm colors in particular. So if you put red over top of a black surface, and boy, I am really striking out on this camera angle here. When you put red over a black surface, you're going to get almost more of a dull brick red result unless you build it up layer after layer after layer. This gives you a very quick one and done auto deep wine red. Having this deep wine red is important because it will increase your color saturation substantially, because what we're going to be putting over this are much warmer reds. So you have cool red in the shadows and warm red in the highlights, which will result in a very intense red gown. And here's what I referenced earlier. I'm also applying the Sigvald Burgundy to the shadowed areas of the gimp here, so he will have more purple undertones instead of desaturated shadows. So we've got a nice base coat of a deep wine red. Let's move on to the highlights. So again, I apologize. The camera angles on this are rough just because I did not account for that big old cup in front of the foreground. I'm used to filming with just a standard paintbrush. So all I'm doing here is applying my highlights to the most raised portions. As you can see, some of it gets in the recesses, but that's totally fine because I'm going to be doing a deep recess shade anyway. I'm highlighting using a bright ivory by ACRYL. The reason I'm using ivory is because it has yellow in it and therefore will result in a warmer red when I apply a red over top of this highlight. So step 2 is just apply a fine layer of bright ivory to the most prominent raised folds of fabric.
Next, we're going to do a recess shade using Flesh Tearers Red. This is a contrast paint, so it is semi-transparent, and I did use a little bit of thinner in there as well, just so it didn't speckle, as it is still a fairly dense contrast paint. And some of you watching may be going, hey, you really oversprayed into your recesses. And yep, I sure did, because again, I'm holding this at an angle I'm not really used to. However, it was still beneficial to have that burgundy base coat, because otherwise we'd be applying this essentially over a gray scale. If we hadn't applied the burgundy first, if we'd have just done it from black, then we would have been applying our ivory highlight over black, which then mutes the ivory, making it not as vibrant, which in turn makes the semi-transparent red less vibrant as well. So just airbrush Flesh Tearers Red into the recesses and make sure to leave a nice bright stripe of ivory on the most raised portions. For the final highlight, I actually started by using the red that comes with this compressor set, and it is a very nice, vibrant scarlet. However, it is fairly transparent. The coverage just isn't quite as opaque as what I have in other reds that I own, but for most people, this will be perfectly fine. It does dry kind of glossy, which just isn't what I wanted for my fabric. I prefer a more matte color, but it is a nice, vibrant red if you're looking for a red highlight. I did end up switching over to Vallejo Scarlet Blood Red just because the coverage is a little bit better, the paint is more opaque. However, here's something to keep in mind. The more opaque a paint is, the more heavily pigmented it is, therefore the kind of thicker the spray will be, so you need to make sure to thin your paints more. You're going to notice a little bit of overspray on these folds here, so thinner paints aren't necessarily a bad thing when you're working with airbrushes, because airbrushing is all about building layers. So if you end up with overspray in your recesses and your deepest folds of the fabric, it's totally fine. You know what your shadow color was. This is the same Sigvald burgundy, the same thing we used before, and I'm just lightly applying it to the recesses. This is with the 0.3mm nozzle that I probably should have been using all along instead of the 0.5. Again, this step is only necessary if you get highlights into your recesses. We're just redarkening them. That's it. By the way, the darker you make your recesses, the brighter your highlights are going to look. That's actually one of the definitions of contrast, is just the extremity in the difference of shadow and highlight. And the airbrush allows you to create a smooth color gradient, but you can further increase the contrast by doing a recess shade with just a traditional brush. This is just Sigvald burgundy again. I'm just swiping this lightly in the recesses, applying it very thinly. There's not very much on my brush, and this is thinned in about an even ratio of paint to thinner. We don't want this too opaque. We want it to be able to just sit in the recesses and sink into that color gradient. So this is what the miniature looks like totally complete. The only thing I used the airbrush for was to apply the undershading and the gradient on her gown. Everything else is just entirely traditional brushwork, mostly shades and glazes of contrast paints with a few highlights added here and there. So you don't need to use your airbrush on every aspect of your miniature in order to get a great result, but it is incredibly helpful to have an airbrush for certain techniques. And this is especially true if you find yourself often painting large, smooth surfaces. Speaking of which, here's one last trick before we finish up. This is Croxagore scales sprayed through the 0.5mm nozzle over top of a metallic surface. This is the back of the Canoptic spider from the Necrons. And all I did was just spray a little bit of silver over top some black primer. Then I heavily, haphazardly dry brushed a bunch of light gold over top of that while listening to thrash metal. And then I just took a cheap piece of sponge, dipped it in some darker gold, and then lightly applied that here and there to create a speckled pattern. Once that was dry, I mixed Croxagore scales contrast with thinner in an even ratio, and then lightly sprayed that over this surface. I got a pretty cool result, but wanted a little bit more color variation, so I just repeated the process and took more dark gold and sponged it sparingly here and there. I also edge highlighted in gold a little bit as well. So this looks pretty neat, and I might actually do one like this later, but I went ahead and just hit it with another coat of Croxagore scales using the airbrush. Again, this applies a very thin, even layer of tint to the miniature, and then once that was dry, I did hit it with a gloss varnish to give it a bit of shine. So the whole reason I wanted to show you that really quick process was to demonstrate that you do not have to get complicated with your airbrush. You don't have to do anything that's actually difficult. By combining it with brush techniques and stippling and sponging, you can create some really awesome effects with very little effort. So if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new. I certainly did, and it was watch your camera angle when you're airbrushing so your viewers can actually see what the heck you're doing, lady. Anyway, I'm a little mad at myself about that, but hopefully you still enjoyed the video, you got the basics down, and above all, hopefully this proves that you don't need an expensive airbrush in order to create something you can be proud of. From what I've seen while using it, I definitely think the Inokraft airbrush kit is a great value for hobbyists who are looking to start airbrushing. I've included a link to the Amazon store where you can pick one up for yourself. This is not an affiliate link. Whether you choose to purchase one through that link or not has no effect on my wallet. Just wanted to put that there for convenience sake if you were interested in getting one for yourself. So let me know what you think in the comments. I usually never do these types of videos, so feedback is appreciated. I hope you enjoyed it, and until we meet again, happy painting, everyone.